"Don't touch the baby. You'll bring bad luck." Those words still ring in my ears. They weren't whispered in anger, but spoken with the kind of casual cruelty that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. I didn't argue. I simply folded my hands in my lap and looked at the child I wasn't allowed to hold. But 3 months later, when the doctor slid a stack of hospital papers across the desk, papers that would decide whether my grandchild received the care he needed, he asked for my signature. And suddenly, my daughter-in-law couldn't even look me in the eye. Let me tell you my story. My name is Eleanor, though most folks just call me Ellie. I'm 72 years old, widowed for nearly a decade, and I live in the same weathered old house my husband Harold and I bought when we were newly married. The house has its creaks and drafts, but it's full of memories. Our wedding photo on the mantel, the oak dining table Harold sanded with his own hands, and the garden where I still tend roses he once planted. Life after Harold's passing was quiet, sometimes painfully so. We never had a large family, just one son, Daniel. For years, Daniel was my joy. I remember the way he used to come home from school, running through the kitchen door with a backpack slung over one shoulder, asking what was for supper before I even had the chance to ask how his day went. He grew into a fine young man, steady and smart, though maybe a bit too eager to please others. When he married Melissa, I had hopes. Every mother wants her child's marriage to bring new light into the family. I bought a new dress for their wedding, brought out Harold's watch to wear on my wrist for luck, and even rehearsed the speech I gave at the reception. Melissa smiled politely back then, though her eyes seemed always measuring, weighing, as if she was deciding whether I fit into her version of Daniel's future. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, love requires adjustment. Families blend slowly like colors on a canvas. You have to give them time to settle. When the news came that Daniel and Melissa were expecting, my heart swelled. I thought of tiny booties, lullabies, and the smell of baby powder filling the air again. I thought of myself not just as Eleanor, the widow who puttered around her house, but as Grandma. It was a title I longed to wear. I spent weeks knitting sweaters, tiny hats with soft pom-poms, and blankets with Harold's initials embroidered in the corners, so our grandchild would always know the love of the grandfather he would never meet. I even dug out an old wooden cradle from the attic, a cradle Harold's father built, where Daniel once slept as an infant. I polished the wood until it gleamed, ready to pass it on to the next generation. But life rarely unfolds the way we dream it will. The day I first went to see the baby, my arms full of gifts, I knocked softly on Daniel and Melissa's front door. Daniel answered, smiling, nervously, his hair mussed from lack of sleep. Melissa was inside, rocking the newborn in her arms. The sight nearly brought tears to my eyes. The tiny face, so pink and perfect, bundled in a blanket I hadn't made. I took a step closer, whispering, "May I hold him?" Melissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. She pulled the baby a little tighter and said, with a voice as cool as ice, "Don't touch the baby. You'll bring bad luck." I froze. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "Pardon?" She repeated it, sharper this time, like she was brushing me aside. "We don't want bad luck. The baby's too small." Daniel stood behind her, shifting uncomfortably, but he didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He just looked at the floor, his silence speaking louder than any words could. I felt my face burn, the sting of humiliation cutting through me. My arms, once open with love, dropped to my sides. I wanted to argue, to remind her that I raised Daniel without ever bringing him bad luck. But something inside me told me not to give her the satisfaction. So I didn't argue. I stood there quietly, forcing a smile as I placed the little knitted sweater on the couch beside her. I said something about needing to get back home, even though I had nowhere else to be. Walking out that door, I felt smaller than I ever had before. A grandmother denied the simplest joy, to hold her grandchild. I carried that moment home with me like a stone in my chest, heavy and cold. But even then, a part of me knew Life has a way of testing us, and sometimes the answers come when we least expect them. The days after that first visit blurred together, but the words never left me. "Don't touch the baby. You'll bring bad luck." It replayed in my head whenever I looked at the tiny sweaters I'd knitted, now folded neatly in a box on the corner of my dresser. Every time I glanced at that old wooden cradle I had polished until it shone, my heart twisted. That cradle had once held Daniel, rocking gently in the nights when Harold would hum old hymns to lull him to sleep. Now it sat empty, unused, as if the very history of our family had been pushed aside like clutter. I told myself to be patient. Perhaps Melissa was tired, overwhelmed. I remembered my own early days of motherhood, how every cry felt urgent, how every visitor felt like an intrusion when I hadn't slept in days. Maybe she didn't mean it. Maybe her words were just born of exhaustion. But then the phone calls stopped. At first, I would call once a week just to check in. Daniel would answer, voice tight, always in a rush. "Mom, it's not a good time," or "We'll call you back later." The return calls never came. I tried to hide my disappointment, reminding myself they had a newborn. Of course, life was hectic. Still, I noticed things. Neighbors mentioned seeing Daniel and Melissa taking the baby for walks. Melissa's mother was often by their side, proudly pushing the stroller. No one ever called me. No one ever invited me. I saw pictures posted online, Melissa holding the baby, surrounded by friends, family, and smiling faces, at birthdays, small gatherings, even Sunday dinners. My son looked happy, his arm around his wife, their baby pressed close, but I was never there. My phone remained silent. My chair at the table remained empty. One Sunday afternoon, my neighbor Emily stopped by to return a dish I'd lent her. She carried a plate of brownies, still warm. As we chatted on the porch, she said casually, "It was nice seeing your grandson at the park this morning. He's getting so big already." I forced a smile, nodding. Yes, he is. But inside, I withered. I hadn't seen him since that first day, not once. When I finally gathered the courage to ask Daniel directly, his words nearly broke me. "Mom, Melissa just feels uncomfortable. She thinks your energy isn't good for the baby. You understand, right?" Energy. Bad luck. It was as if my years of love and sacrifice had been reduced to some superstition, a shadow they wanted to keep away from their child. I wanted to scream, to demand how my own son could let this happen. Instead, I swallowed the words. My voice shook as I said quietly, "I understand." But I didn't. At night, I'd sit in my quiet living room, Harold's empty chair across from me, and wonder how things had gone so wrong. I had been the one to pack Daniel's school lunches, to work late shifts at the diner so he could go to college, to sit up waiting whenever he was late coming home. Harold and I had sacrificed vacations, new cars, even simple comforts, so Daniel could have opportunities we never did. And yet here I was, erased. Still, I tried. On holidays, I baked pies and sent them over with notes. Melissa never responded. Daniel would text, "Thanks," once in a while, but nothing more. On birthdays, I left gifts at their door. Little things like children's books, blankets, or a handmade toy. They disappeared without acknowledgement, as if swallowed by the house itself. The cruelest part wasn't the silence. It was the whispers. At church one morning, a woman approached me with a sympathetic smile. "I heard Melissa doesn't want you around the baby. She thinks you're bad luck." The words struck like lightning. I hadn't realized Melissa had spoken of me outside their home. She hadn't just cut me off privately. She had painted me as a danger, a curse in the eyes of others. I left the service early that day, holding back tears until I reached my car. Sitting there, hands gripping the steering wheel, I felt something shift inside me. The humiliation was sharp, yes, but beneath it, something steadier began to grow, a quiet strength, a patience that comes from years of weathering storms. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. But I promised myself one thing. When the time came, I wouldn't need to defend who I was. Life would show the truth far better than I ever could. And as fate would have it, that time came sooner than I imagined. It was a rainy Tuesday when the call came. Not to me, of course. My phone stayed silent as it so often did these days. I only heard about it through a neighbor. Again. I was sipping tea by the kitchen window when Mrs. Carter from next door knocked on my door, umbrella dripping, worry in her eyes. "Eleanor," she said breathlessly, "I just saw Daniel rushing Melissa and the baby into their car. They said the little one's very sick, on their way to the hospital." My cup clattered in its saucer. My heart lurched. Without a second thought, I grabbed my shawl and keys. I didn't even put on proper shoes, just slipped my feet into the nearest pair and hurried out into the storm. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital felt endless, rain streaking the windshield, wipers struggling to keep pace. My mind spun with memories of Daniel's own childhood illnesses, fevers I sat up through the night to tend, the measles that had me pacing the floor until dawn, the times Harold held me steady when I thought my boy's small body couldn't handle another cough. By the time I reached the hospital, my hands trembled as I parked. Inside, the fluorescent lights glared too bright, the smell of antiseptic clawing at my nerves. I followed the sound of hurried voices until I found the pediatric ward. There they were, Daniel and Melissa, seated tensely in the waiting area, Melissa clutching the baby so tightly his tiny face was barely visible under the blanket. Daniel's face was pale, his eyes darting with worry. For a moment, I just stood there, watching from a distance. My son looked like a boy again, frightened, helpless. My heart ached with the urge to go to him, to comfort him, to take some of the weight he carried. I stepped closer, my voice soft. "Daniel." He looked up. Relief flickered across his features but quickly disappeared beneath tension. Melissa's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing like a hawk. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "I came to see my family," I replied gently, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. Her grip on the baby tightened. "You shouldn't be here. We don't need your bad luck." Her words, sharp and cold, echoed in the sterile hallway. A nurse passing by glanced at us, frowning. I wanted to protest, to beg just for one glimpse of the child, but the sight of Daniel's shoulders hunched in defeat silenced me. He looked torn, caught between his wife's glare and my quiet presence, so I simply said, "I'll wait over there," and sank into a chair on the far end of the corridor. For hours I sat alone, hands clasped tightly, praying silently for the baby's health. Through the glass of a nearby observation window, I caught glimpses of doctors moving swiftly, nurses adjusting equipment, Melissa pacing nervously. Every so often, Daniel passed by me, his steps quick, his eyes averted. He didn't speak, but the way his hand brushed against his hair, an old nervous habit of his, told me all I needed to know. He was scared. Night fell, and the hospital quieted except for the hum of machines and the occasional cry of an infant. I shifted in my seat, my back stiff, but I didn't leave. And then, sometime after midnight, a young doctor approached. His expression was grave, but his tone calm. "Are you Mrs. Eleanor?" he asked. I blinked, startled. "Yes, that's me." "I understand you're Daniel's mother." He paused, lowering his voice. "We're running into complications with the baby's treatment. Insurance doesn't fully cover the specialized care he needs. We'll need a guarantor, someone who can authorize and sign the financial responsibility papers." For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. My eyes flicked to Daniel and Melissa, who were speaking with a nurse a few feet away, oblivious to this conversation. The doctor looked at me firmly. "Would you be willing to step in? It's urgent. Without immediate authorization, we can't proceed." At that moment, everything Melissa had said to me, every cruel remark, every door closed in my face, every whispered accusation of being bad luck, faded into nothing. Because this wasn't about her. It wasn't even about Daniel. It was about my grandson. I straightened my shoulders, the weight of 72 years resting on me like armor. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Bring me the papers." When the doctor returned minutes later with the forms, I felt Melissa's gaze burn into me. She had finally noticed. Her face went pale, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no sound came out. The doctor set the clipboard in front of me. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but steady. Line after line, I signed my name. With each stroke, I reclaimed something Melissa had tried to strip from me. When I handed the papers back, the doctor smiled, his shoulders relaxing. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor. You may have just saved this child's life." Melissa turned away, unable to meet my eyes. Daniel lingered, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time in years. Conflicted, ashamed, grateful, all at once. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The truth was written in ink, in my name, on every page. The hours after I signed the papers felt different, subtly but unmistakably. The tension in the room shifted. Nurses who had barely noticed me before now came over, offering updates and cups of coffee. Doctors nodded respectfully when they passed. It wasn't because I had demanded recognition. No, I hadn't spoken a single boastful word. But the truth sat there, heavy and undeniable, in every conversation. The grandmother they had dismissed, the bad luck woman they had silenced, was the one whose name now made everything possible. Melissa hated it. She sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed, her face pale and tight with something between shame and fury. She spoke in short, clipped sentences to the staff, her eyes darting toward me only when she thought I wasn't looking. Each time, her lips pressed into a thinner line, as if the very sight of me unsettled her. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed weighed down by guilt. He hovered between us, wringing his hands, his eyes betraying a conflict he didn't dare voice. When a nurse thanked me directly, "Mrs. Eleanor, we're grateful you stepped in. This little one's lucky to have you," I saw Daniel flinch, as though the words exposed him. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a thing. I simply nodded, offering a small smile, and kept my focus where it belonged, on my grandson. The baby's condition was fragile. Tubes and wires attached to his tiny body made my heart ache, but every shallow breath he took was a promise that he was still fighting. In the evenings, when Melissa went home to rest and Daniel dozed uncomfortably in a chair, I stayed. I sat beside the crib, humming softly, old lullabies Harold used to sing, songs Daniel had once heard from my lips when fever burned his brow. The nurses noticed. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, whispered to me one night, "He seems calmer when you're here. Babies know when they're loved." Her words filled me with both warmth and sorrow. How could something so simple, love, presence, a steady hand, be twisted into bad luck? I leaned over, brushing a finger lightly across the baby's tiny hand. His fingers curled instinctively around mine, fragile yet firm. Tears welled in my eyes. "You'll never know it now, little one," I whispered, "but your grandmother will always be here for you. Always." Melissa returned the next morning, her hair perfectly styled despite the long nights, her expression brittle. She took one look at me sitting by the crib and snapped, "You don't need to act like you belong here. Money doesn't make you family." Her voice was low, meant for my ears alone. I looked up at her, steady and calm. "Family," I said softly, "is shown in action, not words." Her cheeks flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, but no retort came. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel, muttering something under her breath. I noticed Daniel had heard. He stood frozen near the doorway, caught between us, shame written all over his face. For the first time, he didn't defend her. He didn't defend me either, but his silence spoke volumes. The night stretched into weeks. Tests, treatments, long consultations with specialists. Each time I was present. Not loudly, not demanding, but steady, like an anchor holding everything together when the storm threatened to sweep us all away. Melissa's resentment deepened, but her protests grew weaker. When paperwork needed signing, doctors no longer looked at her. They looked at me. And when bills were discussed, my name was the one on record. One afternoon, as I quietly paid another invoice at the billing desk, I noticed Melissa standing nearby, her face pale. She hadn't realized until then that my signature meant more than approval. It meant financial responsibility. The staff treated me as the guarantor, the primary contact. In their eyes, I wasn't just involved. I was essential. Melissa avoided me after that. She would leave the room when I entered, linger in the hallway, or busy herself with her phone. She couldn't bear to look at me, not when every reminder of her cruel words now hung like a shadow over her. And I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. Life was teaching her what my protests never could. One night, as I hummed softly to the baby, Daniel finally broke the silence. "Mom," he whispered, his voice low and hoarse from lack of sleep. I should have stopped her. I should have said something that day. I didn't answer right away. I kept humming, letting the baby's little hand rest against my finger. Then finally, I said, "You're his father, Daniel. The best thing you can do for him is show him the truth, not just say it." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He nodded slowly, sinking into the chair beside me. For a moment, we sat in silence, mother and son bound by something deeper than words. And though Melissa's shadow loomed just outside the doorway, I knew this much was certain. The walls she had built between us were starting to crack. By the third week, the hospital had become almost like a second home to me. I knew the smell of the cafeteria coffee, the squeak of the janitor's cart on the linoleum floors, the shift change of nurses at dawn. I had memorized the beeping rhythm of my grandson's monitors, the sound that both reassured me he was still with us and haunted me with every irregular beep. One morning, I was called into the administrator's office. It was a small, neat space lined with filing cabinets, a desk stacked with manila folders, and a computer humming quietly in the corner. A middle-aged woman in a navy blazer greeted me with a polite smile. "Mrs. Eleanor, thank you for coming." I folded my shawl around me and sat down. "Of course. What is it?" She tapped a folder on the desk. "We've finalized the guarantor documents for your grandson's treatment. All billing and financial responsibility are officially under your name. Any correspondence, insurance adjustments, or legal inquiries will be directed to you as the primary contact." The words settled in the air like a gavel striking. For a moment, I sat in silence. Then I nodded slowly. "I understand." When I stepped back into the hallway, Melissa was there. She had clearly been waiting, hovering outside like a restless shadow. The instant she saw me with the folder in my hands, her face drained of color. What did they tell you?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp. I met her eyes evenly. "They told me everything is under my name now. I'm the guarantor." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She looked around, at the nurses passing by, at Daniel speaking quietly with a doctor down the hall. The realization dawned on her. This wasn't just between us anymore. This was public, visible, irrefutable. The staff knew. The records knew. The hospital itself knew. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw clenched. But she couldn't argue. Not here. Not in front of witnesses who already understood the truth. Later that day, I overheard whispers in the cafeteria. 2 women in scrubs sat at the next table, their voices low. "It's the grandmother," one said. "She's the reason that baby's getting treatment. Signed everything herself." "Really?" the other replied, shaking her head. "I thought the parents were handling it." "Number, she's the one paying. You should have seen the daughter-in-law's face." I pretended not to hear, sipping my tea quietly. Inside, though, I felt something I hadn't in months. Not triumph, not gloating, but justice. Melissa tried, of course, to salvage her pride. That evening, she cornered me in the corridor. Her voice trembled with suppressed rage. "You think this makes you important? You think a few signatures change anything? You're still you." I looked at her calmly. Yes, I am still me. The same woman who raised Daniel. The same grandmother who would do anything for her family. The same bad luck you told me not to touch. Her face flushed red. She took a step back as if my words had struck her. She wanted to scream, to argue, but she couldn't. The weight of reality was against her. That night, as I sat beside my grandson's crib, I thought about how life has a way of turning cruelty inside out. Melissa had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a superstition, a shadow. But when it mattered most, it was my name, my presence, my quiet endurance that carried weight. Daniel approached me softly. He looked tired, his eyes rimmed with red, but there was something new in his expression, respect, perhaps, or shame. "Mom," he whispered, "I didn't know they would put everything under your name. I should have known." I reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "You didn't need to know. What matters is that your son is getting what he needs." His voice cracked. "I should have defended you. That day when she—" He trailed off, unable to finish. I shook my head. "Daniel, life has a way of showing truth. You don't need to speak for me. The truth speaks loud enough on its own." From then on, Melissa barely spoke when I was present. She answered questions from doctors with curt nods, avoided eye contact when paperwork was brought up, and busied herself scrolling endlessly on her phone. But silence can be its own form of confession, and every time she avoided my gaze, I knew she felt the sting of her own words reflected back at her. The irony was sharp and undeniable. The woman who once told me not to touch the baby because I was bad luck now owed her child's very survival to the signature of the grandmother she had scorned. And the cruelest part? Everyone else knew it too. Hospitals have a rhythm of their own. During the day, the corridors buzz with doctors on rounds, nurses juggling charts, families speaking in hushed voices near vending machines. But at night, everything softens. The halls grow quieter, the fluorescent lights dim slightly, and time seems to stretch, heavy and slow. It was in those long nights that I found my place. I stayed when others went home. Melissa, always restless, preferred to sleep in her own bed. Daniel tried to keep vigil, but exhaustion overtook him more often than not. It was me, the grandmother who supposedly brought bad luck, who remained at the baby's side through the silent hours. I sat in that stiff chair, my shawl wrapped around my shoulders, watching the steady rise and fall of his tiny chest. The machines beeped gently, like a lullaby of their own, and when his little face twitched in distress, when he whimpered softly, I leaned close and hummed. The songs weren't modern ones. They were the hymns Harold had sung to Daniel, the lullabies passed down through generations, soft, steady, low, the kind of melodies that carried more comfort than words. And every time, without fail, the baby calmed. His breathing steadied, his fingers curled around mine, his body settled into rest. One night, a nurse paused at the doorway, watching quietly. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "He knows your voice," she said. "You're a comfort to him. Babies, they can feel love. It makes a difference." I smiled faintly, my eyes never leaving my grandson. That's all I want him to feel. Her words warmed me, but they also twisted the knife deeper. Melissa had accused me of bringing misfortune, yet here, in the stillness of the night, it was clear. I brought peace. Melissa, of course, resented my presence. One morning, she arrived earlier than usual and found me dozing in the chair, my hand resting gently on the crib's edge. Her face tightened instantly. "You don't need to be here every night," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to rattle the air. "You're overstepping." I blinked awake, straightened my shawl, and met her gaze calmly. "I'm not here for me, I'm here for him." I nodded toward the crib. Melissa's lips curled in disdain. "Don't act like you're the savior. Money and lullabies don't make you family." Her words should have hurt. Months ago, they would have. But by then, they sounded hollow, like a broken bell. I simply said, "Family is proven in what you do when it matters, not what you say when it's easy." She stiffened, her face flushing with anger. Daniel, who had been standing by the door, froze mid-step. For the first time, he didn't look at me with avoidance or Melissa with blind loyalty. He just stood there, caught in the truth of my words. Melissa muttered something under her breath and stormed out, the echo of her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Later that day, Daniel finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, worn thin from weeks of stress. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make things right between you and Melissa." I folded the shawl tighter around my shoulders and looked at him with the patience only years can give. "You don't have to fix it, Daniel. Life has a way of revealing truth. All you need to do is stand where your heart knows you should." He looked at me, eyes heavy with guilt, but also with something new: respect. For the first time in a long while, my son saw me not as an inconvenience, not as someone to pacify, but as a pillar that held the family upright when everything else wavered. The nights continued. Some were easier, some filled with fear as alarms beeped and doctors rushed in. Through it all, I stayed. I remembered Harold's words from long ago. "Strength doesn't always roar, Ellie. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's just staying when others leave." I understood now. My presence wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, constant, undeniable. And though Melissa tried to erase me with her cruelty, every night proved her wrong. Because when the baby whimpered, it was my voice that soothed him. When the nurses needed a signature, it was my hand they sought. And when Daniel felt the weight of helplessness, it was me he leaned on silently. One evening, as dawn painted pale light across the hospital windows, I sat humming while Daniel dozed nearby. The baby's small hand wrapped tightly around my finger. In that moment, I realized something profound. Melissa could try to strip me of titles, of recognition, of presence, but she couldn't take away what had already been written: my love, my history, my place in this child's life. And no matter how much she turned her face away, she would never be able to erase the truth. I was the grandmother, the anchor, the quiet strength she could neither control nor replace. By the 4th week, the baby had stabilized enough that hope began to replace fear. The doctors smiled more often, their updates cautiously optimistic. Nurses who once rushed past now stopped to coo softly over him, their relief palpable. But with that hope came a new storm. Melissa's pride could no longer bear the weight of silence. It began one afternoon in the family consultation room, a small space with beige walls and a round table cluttered with pamphlets on recovery and financial planning. Daniel and I were already seated when Melissa entered. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, her posture rigid. She didn't greet me, didn't even glance my way. A financial officer laid out a folder on the table. "As you know, the guarantor is responsible for finalizing billing agreements as your child transitions into longer-term care. Mrs. Eleanor, you'll need to initial here and here." The officer slid the papers toward me. I took the pen calmly, steady as stone, and began to sign. Melissa snapped. "This is ridiculous." Her voice rose, startling the officer. "She shouldn't be in charge of this. She's not even welcome in our home." The words hung heavy in the air. Daniel's head whipped toward her, eyes wide. The officer froze, glancing between us. I placed the pen down slowly, folding my hands together, and looked at Melissa with quiet patience. Whether I'm welcome in your home or not doesn't change the fact that my name is the one on record. I'm not here for power, Melissa. I'm here because that baby, my grandson, needed someone to act. Melissa's face flushed crimson. You think this makes you a saint? Signing papers doesn't erase the fact that you bring nothing but bad luck. Ever since you... Melissa. Daniel's voice cracked like a whip across the room. He had never raised his voice to her before, not in my presence. His cheeks burned, his eyes hard. Enough. She froze, stunned. You don't get to talk to my mother that way, he continued, his voice trembling with anger. Not after everything she's done. She stayed when you left. She paid when we couldn't. His voice broke. He swallowed hard, then finished, softer. She's the reason our son is alive right now. The room went silent. Melissa's lips quivered, her eyes darting to me, then to Daniel. For the first time, I saw fear in her expression, not of me, but of the truth finally spoken aloud. The officer cleared his throat awkwardly, gathering the papers. I'll, give you a moment. He slipped out of the room, leaving the three of us in the thick air of confrontation. Melissa turned on Daniel, her voice trembling with fury. You're taking her side over me? Daniel pressed his hands to his temples. This isn't about sides, Melissa. It's about facts. You told Mom she was bad luck, and then when it mattered most, it was her name that saved us. Do you realize how that looks? How that sounds? Her eyes filled with tears, hot, angry tears. She whipped toward me, her voice low and venomous. You love this, don't you? Sitting there smug, watching me squirm. I inhaled slowly, keeping my composure. Melissa, I said gently, I don't love any of this. But I won't apologize for being needed. You may not want me as part of your family, but life decided otherwise. And maybe one day you'll see that being a grandmother isn't about luck. It's about love. She blinked rapidly, her chin trembling. Without another word, she stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Daniel slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands. I don't know what to do anymore, he whispered. I reached over, resting my hand on his arm. You don't need to do everything at once, Daniel. Just keep loving your son. The rest will fall into place. That evening, word of the confrontation spread quickly through the ward. Hospitals are like small towns. Rumors travel fast. I caught fragments of whispers as I walked the halls. The daughter-in-law shouting at the grandmother? She's the one paying, isn't she? Imagine calling your mother-in-law bad luck when she's the one saving your child. Melissa's humiliation was no longer confined to private corners. Her cruelty had been dragged into the light, and it clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Meanwhile, I carried myself the same way I always had, quietly, steadily, without gloating. But inside, I felt the shift. For the first time, Daniel had spoken. For the first time, Melissa's mask had cracked in public. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. The balance of power had changed, and it wasn't shifting back. Weeks blurred into each other, the hospital becoming a strange kind of world unto itself. Each day began with the beep of machines and ended with weary sighs, the same walls holding both despair and hope in equal measure. But little by little, I noticed the difference. The baby's cheeks grew rosier, his breathing steadier. The doctors began using words like improvement and progress. Each time I heard them, I felt a quiet surge of relief, like air filling my lungs after weeks of holding my breath. One morning, the lead pediatrician, Dr. Klein, approached us with a smile. Good news, he's responding well to treatment. If things continue like this, we'll be preparing for discharge within a week. The words hung in the air, a blessing we had long prayed for. Daniel exhaled sharply, tears welling in his eyes. Melissa clutched her purse strap tightly, her expression a mixture of relief and something darker. Fear, perhaps, at the thought of leaving behind the safety net of hospital staff. And me? I felt peace. For all the pain, all the sleepless nights, my grandson had made it through. That was enough. But with recovery came new dynamics. The hospital staff no longer whispered. They spoke openly. Nurses stopped me in the halls to say things like, "You must be so proud, Grandma. You've been here every day. He's lucky to have you." I always smiled and nodded, though I noticed how Melissa stiffened whenever she heard those words. She avoided my gaze, kept her distance, her jaw tightening each time another nurse praised me. The same woman who once told me not to touch the baby now couldn't escape the truth that everyone else saw plainly. Even Daniel seemed changed. He asked my opinion when doctors explained next steps. He leaned on me when decisions needed to be made. And when Melissa muttered objections under her breath, he silenced her with a look. For the first time in years, my son and I stood side by side, not as strangers, but as family again. The day of discharge arrived quietly, with little ceremony. Melissa dressed the baby in a brand new outfit, fussing over every detail. Daniel handled the paperwork with Dr. Klein. And I, as guarantor, signed the final release forms. My name was the one stamped across the page, a fact Melissa couldn't bear to watch. As we left the hospital, the air outside felt fresher, almost too bright after so many weeks indoors. Daniel strapped the baby into the car seat, his hands steady but tender. Melissa climbed into the passenger side, her face turned away. I stood beside the car, watching. "Mom," Daniel said softly, pausing before shutting the door. "Thank you. For everything." His voice caught on the last word, heavy with meaning. I only nodded, my throat too tight to respond. Life at home, however, was not as simple as signing discharge papers. Melissa grew more brittle, more resentful. She insisted on keeping visits short whenever I stopped by, her tone clipped and cold. But she could no longer deny me outright, not after everything. Daniel, still weighed down by guilt, made sure I was included. The first time I held my grandson at their home, I felt tears sting my eyes. He nestled into my arms, his small body warm against my chest. Melissa hovered nearby, her jaw tight, but she didn't dare snatch him away this time. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The woman who once forbade me to touch him now had no choice but to watch me cradle him openly. I looked down at his tiny face, his eyes fluttering shut, and whispered softly, "Your grandmother's here, little one. Always." But Melissa's bitterness didn't fade. It hardened. At a family gathering weeks later, she tried to salvage her pride. Surrounded by relatives, she boasted loudly about how they had handled the hospital crisis, how Daniel had been so strong. She conveniently omitted my name, but the whispers spread faster than her words. Cousins leaned toward me, murmuring, "We know the truth. We heard what you did." Neighbors offered quiet nods of respect. Even distant relatives sent letters thanking me for stepping in. And Melissa, she heard those whispers too. Every kind word directed at me was a mirror held up to her cruelty. At night, when I sat back in my old rocking chair with a cup of tea, I reflected on it all. Melissa could keep her cold glares, her clipped remarks, her bitter pride. None of it mattered anymore. Because when it had truly counted, when life had demanded action, it wasn't superstition or sharp words that saved that baby. It was love. It was presence. It was me. And though Melissa still couldn't look me in the eye, I no longer needed her, too. The truth was etched in every hospital record, whispered in every neighbor's voice, seen in the way my grandson's tiny hands reached for me instinctively. I had been erased once, but now I was undeniable. In small towns, news doesn't stay contained. It slips through cracks, rides on whispers, and by the time it reaches your ears, it has already been told and retold a dozen times. So it was with us. By the time my grandson was strong enough to be brought out in a stroller, the story had already spread far and wide. At church, at the market, at the little cafe on Main Street, people approached me with soft smiles and words of quiet respect. "You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor," one lady from church whispered, squeezing my hand. "I heard what you did for that baby." Another time at the grocer's, a clerk leaned over the counter and said, "You're the guarantor, right? Paid for everything? God bless you." I never bragged, never confirmed nor denied. I only smiled faintly and said, "I did what any grandmother would do." But Melissa couldn't escape the truth. The first time she brought the baby to church, I noticed the way heads turned. Whispers stirred like a breeze through tall grass. I sat quietly in my pew, my shawl folded neatly in my lap, but I felt the weight of eyes on all of us. After the service, people surrounded me first, not her. They patted my shoulder, thanked me, praised me. Melissa stood stiffly to the side, clutching the baby, her smile brittle. One elderly man, Mr. Peterson, clasped my hand and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "That boy's alive because of his grandmother's sacrifice. Don't let anyone forget that." Melissa's face turned pale. She forced a laugh, but it sounded strained. "Well, Daniel and I—" Mr. Peterson cut her off kindly but firmly. "No, dear. We all know who signed those papers. We all know who stayed." Melissa's mouth shut like a slammed door. Even within the family, the narrative shifted. Relatives who once deferred to Melissa's polished smile now gravitated toward me. At a family dinner, my niece leaned across the table saying, "Aunt Ellie, you've always been the strong one. I don't know how you managed those long nights." Melissa's fork froze halfway to her mouth. She tried to change the subject, but the conversation returned again and again to the same theme: gratitude toward me, quiet disapproval of her. Daniel said little during these moments, but I noticed how his eyes lingered on me, soft with guilt and recognition. For years he had let Melissa's words carry weight. Now he saw clearly that words mean nothing without actions. Of course, Melissa tried to spin her own version of events. She told neighbors that she had kept the baby strong through willpower, that Daniel had been the rock during the ordeal. She painted me as a mere bystander, someone who helped a little when asked. But stories have a way of finding their own truth. The hospital staff had spoken, the records existed, and more than that, people had seen. They had seen me in the corridors, night after night, my shawl draped across my shoulders, humming lullabies in the half-dark. They had seen Melissa leaving early, her heels clicking away into the night. The contrast was impossible to hide. One evening, I attended a community supper at the church hall. I hadn't planned to go, but Mrs. Carter had insisted. "It's time people see you outside those hospital walls again," she said. When I walked in, the room grew quiet for a moment, then warm with smiles. People waved me over, saved me a seat, piled my plate high with food. Everywhere I turned, there were kind words. "So glad your grandson is doing better. We're proud of you, Eleanor." Melissa arrived later with Daniel and the baby. She wore a bright dress and her usual painted-on smile, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. She must have felt it too, the way attention shifted, the way respect was directed toward me instead of her. At one point, a woman from the choir leaned down to coo at the baby and then looked at Melissa with a polite smile. "You must be so grateful to have such a mother-in-law. Not everyone would sacrifice so much." Melissa's smile faltered. She murmured something under her breath, then quickly excused herself to the restroom. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. The truth was no longer mine to defend. It belonged to the community now. Every whisper, every nod, every sideways glance at Melissa carried the weight of her own words turned against her. She had called me bad luck. But in the eyes of everyone around us, I had become something else entirely. A grandmother who refused to give up, a woman who loved quietly but fiercely. And that truth was far heavier than any insult she could ever throw at me. That night, as I walked home beneath the glow of street lamps, I realized something. I no longer felt erased. I no longer carried the stone of humiliation in my chest. Melissa could twist her words, but she couldn't twist reality. I had been there. I had stayed. I had acted. And now, the whole world knew it. When the baby was finally well enough to be shown proudly to the family, Daniel and Melissa hosted a small gathering at their house. I wasn't sure if I would even be invited, but a week before, Daniel called me himself. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "we're having the family over next Saturday. I want you there." The words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time in years, my son wasn't inviting me out of obligation or to appease Melissa. He was choosing me. I arrived early carrying a pie I had baked from an old family recipe. When I walked through the door, relatives were already gathered. Cousins, uncles, nieces. The air buzzed with conversation, the smell of roasted chicken and casseroles filling the space. The baby, healthier now, was passed from arm to arm, everyone cooing and fussing. When he finally came to me, I felt his small hand grab my finger tightly, as if he knew where he belonged. The room quieted for just a moment, watching me cradle him. "He looks so calm with her," someone whispered. Another voice added, "Of course. She's the one who stayed." Melissa stiffened across the room, her smile plastered but brittle. She tried to direct the conversation away, clapping her hands and saying loudly, "All right, let's eat before the food gets cold." But it was too late. The atmosphere had shifted. During dinner, conversations flowed naturally toward me. A cousin leaned in, eyes wide. "Aunt Ellie, I heard you signed everything for the hospital. Is that true?" I smiled faintly, cutting my chicken. "I did what I could." An uncle shook his head in admiration. "Not many people could do what you did. That baby owes his life to you." Melissa's fork clinked sharply against her plate. She muttered, "We all did our part." But her voice was drowned out by another relative saying, "Daniel's lucky to have a mother like you." Daniel, sitting beside me, nodded silently. He didn't correct them. He didn't defend Melissa. He simply let the truth stand on its own. After dinner, people gathered in the living room. I sat in the old armchair, the baby nestled in my arms. Family members circled close, asking me questions, reminiscing about Harold, praising the strength they claimed I had always shown. Melissa lingered on the edges, holding a half-empty glass of wine, her smile tight, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. Every laugh, every compliment directed toward me was a reminder of her own words, her own attempt to erase me. Finally, she couldn't hold it in any longer. She stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Can we stop pretending she's some kind of hero?" The room went silent. All eyes turned toward her. Melissa's face flushed, but she pushed on. Yes, she signed some papers. Yes, she stayed at the hospital. But that doesn't change the fact that she's difficult, that she makes people uncomfortable. Melissa. Daniel's voice was firm, louder than hers, and filled with something I had rarely heard before. Authority. "Enough!" Her mouth snapped shut. Daniel looked around the room, then back at his wife. "Everyone here knows the truth. Mom saved us when we couldn't save ourselves. If you can't acknowledge that, then maybe you should be the one who's uncomfortable." The silence that followed was thick. Relatives shifted uneasily, but not a single person spoke in Melissa's defense. She stood there, her chest rising and falling, eyes shining with angry tears. Then, without a word, she set her glass down, hard on the counter, and stormed out of the room. The baby stirred in my arms, letting out a small cry. I rocked him gently, humming until he settled again. Slowly, conversations resumed, quieter, more thoughtful. Relatives avoided mentioning Melissa, their focus returning to the child, to me, to the family that had chosen, consciously or not, where their loyalties lay. As the evening wore on and people began to leave, several stopped to squeeze my hand, to whisper, "Don't let her get to you," or "We know the truth." When the last guest had gone, I rose to gather my things. Daniel lingered near the door, his expression tired but resolute. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't know if things will ever be the same between you and Melissa, but I want you to know, I see you now, I see what you've done." I reached out, cupping his cheek the way I had when he was a boy. "That's all I ever wanted, Daniel, for you to see me." That night, as I walked home under the quiet stars, I thought about the strange twists of life. Melissa had tried to erase me, to push me out of their world. Instead, her cruelty had made my place undeniable. The irony was sharp, almost poetic. The very woman who told me I brought bad luck had watched her world unravel because of her own bitterness. And me? I had only stayed true to who I was, a grandmother who loved too deeply to walk away. The days following the family gathering carried a heaviness that clung to the air. Word of Melissa's outburst spread just as quickly as the story of the hospital had. Relatives called me in the evenings, their voices soft with concern but tinged with indignation. "Aunt Ellie, I don't know how you put up with her," one cousin whispered over the phone. "She humiliated herself more than she hurt you," another said. Even Mrs. Carter from next door dropped by with a basket of muffins. "I heard about Saturday," she said, shaking her head. "That girl doesn't know the treasure she has in you." I smiled politely each time, brushing off their sympathy with a simple, "I did what I had to do." But inside, I couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction. Life had drawn its lines clearly, and Melissa stood on the wrong side. Daniel began visiting more often, sometimes with the baby, sometimes alone. He looked tired, his shoulders heavy, but there was a softness in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, he brought the baby over, the diaper bag slung haphazardly over his shoulder. Melissa didn't come. "Is everything all right?" I asked, taking the baby into my arms. Daniel sighed, sinking into Harold's old chair. She's angry, Mom. Says I embarrassed her in front of the family. Says everyone's taking your side." I rocked the baby gently, his tiny hand gripping my shawl. "And what do you think, Daniel?" He looked at me, his eyes glistening. "I think she brought it on, herself. I think I should have spoken up for you a long time ago." My heart ached with both pride and sorrow. I reached across, laying a hand over his. "We can't change the past, but we can choose differently now." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on his son sleeping peacefully in my arms. Melissa, however, grew colder. At church, she avoided me entirely, sitting on the opposite side of the sanctuary. At family functions, she offered clipped greetings, her eyes sliding past mine as though I were a ghost. But no matter how much she tried to push me aside, she couldn't change what everyone knew. The whispers followed her. At the market, I overheard women murmur, "That's the one who called her mother-in-law bad luck." At the doctor's office, a receptionist leaned toward me after Melissa left and said, "She should be ashamed." And the thing about shame is, it doesn't stay private. It seeps into everything, into glances, into silences, into strained smiles. Melissa carried it like a cloak she couldn't shake off. One evening, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Melissa stood there, her expression taut, her eyes burning with something between fury and desperation. "We need to talk," she said flatly. I stepped aside, letting her in. She remained standing, her arms crossed tightly. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat. "Everyone treats you like some saint, but you don't live with the pressure I do. You don't know what it's like to have everyone comparing me to you, to feel like I'm never enough." Her words caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw not just cruelty in her eyes, but fear. Fear of not measuring up. I spoke softly. "Melissa, I never wanted to compete with you. I only wanted to love my family." She shook her head, tears brimming. "You'll never understand." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. I stood in the silence afterward, the baby's sweater half knitted on my lap, and realized Melissa's battle wasn't really with me. It was with herself, and that was something I could never fix for her. Daniel continued to drift closer. He confided in me more, asked for advice, even stayed for dinner once or twice. Each time I saw the shift, subtle but steady. He was beginning to see that love isn't about pride or appearances. It's about presence. And every time my grandson reached for me, giggling when I kissed his cheeks, I knew that the bond Melissa had tried to sever was stronger than ever. Late one night, as I rocked in Harold's chair with the baby asleep against my chest, I thought back to those words that had haunted me. "Don't touch the baby, you'll bring bad luck." I looked down at the child breathing softly, his tiny fingers curled around mine, and I smiled. If this was bad luck, then it was the kind that saves lives, the kind that brings truth to light, the kind that shows who truly belongs, and no amount of bitterness from Melissa could ever erase that. Life settled into a strange rhythm after the storm. The baby grew stronger, his cheeks round and pink, his cries louder, his laughter brighter. Each milestone felt like a gift. The first time he smiled, the first time he grasped a toy, the way his eyes followed me across the room when I visited. And though Melissa still tried to control the narrative, she couldn't change the reality written in the child's gaze. He knew me. He recognized me. He reached for me without hesitation. No whispered words of bad luck could erase what love had already carved into his little heart. Daniel came by more often, sometimes with the baby in tow, sometimes just to sit and talk. He confessed once, his voice heavy with guilt, "I let her push you out for too long. I should have done more." I laid a hand gently over his, my voice calm. "Daniel, life shows us the truth in its own time. Don't waste yours drowning in guilt. Use it to be better." His eyes softened, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy I once raised, the boy who had trusted me implicitly, who had run home from school eager to tell me his stories. That boy was still there, under the weariness of adulthood, finding his way back. Melissa remained distant. In public, she wore her smile like armor, but I could see the cracks. At family gatherings, she no longer snapped openly at me, but she also no longer commanded the room. Conversations drifted past her, toward me, toward the baby, toward Daniel. She had tried to cast me as an outsider, a shadow, but life had rewritten the roles. She was the one now standing on the edges, while I sat quietly in the center. Not by force, not by demand, but by the natural gravity of truth. One afternoon, I found myself back in my quiet kitchen, a cup of tea cooling between my hands. The house felt different somehow, lighter. For years, I had carried the weight of rejection, of being unwanted, of being told I was bad luck. But now, sitting there with sunlight pouring through the lace curtains, I realized the weight was gone. I thought of Harold, of the way he used to reassure me in his steady voice. "Ellie, you don't need to fight to be seen. People who matter will see you for who you are." He had been right. I hadn't needed to shout or argue or prove myself through anger. I had simply stayed, present, steady. And when the moment came, when it truly mattered, it was my name that saved that child, my love that carried him through, my presence that could not be erased. Weeks later, I attended another community supper at the church hall. People greeted me warmly, their faces lighting up as I entered. "There she is," someone whispered, "the grandmother who saved her family." I smiled faintly, my shawl wrapped snugly around me. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. Melissa avoided me that evening, her smile thinner than ever, her laugh too sharp, her eyes darting with unease. She couldn't bear the weight of recognition surrounding me, but I felt no need to retaliate. Life had already handed her the harshest mirror, her own reflection. That night, back at home, Daniel arrived with the baby. Melissa hadn't come. We sat together in the living room, the baby giggling on my lap as Daniel watched quietly. "Mom," he said suddenly, his voice catching, "I want him to grow up knowing who you are. Not the lies, not the things she said, the truth. I want him to know you." Tears pricked my eyes. I kissed the baby's forehead, breathing in his soft scent. "Then you've already done it, Daniel. You brought him here." As the evening drew to a close and they left, I stood in the doorway watching them go, the baby bundled in his car seat, Daniel carrying him with care. The sky above was streaked with stars, silent and eternal, and I thought of how far we had come. From the moment Melissa's voice had sliced through my heart with that cruel command, "Don't touch the baby, you'll bring bad luck," to now, when the child I wasn't allowed to hold had spent the evening laughing in my arms. It wasn't luck that had carried us here. It was love. Quiet, patient, unwavering love. And in the end, that was stronger than pride, stronger than gossip, stronger than cruelty. That was the truth that endured. Months passed, seasons shifted. The leaves that had burned orange and gold during the baby's illness fell, and winter crept in with its quiet snow. By the time spring returned, my grandson was sitting upright, babbling and reaching for everything in sight, and every time Daniel brought him over, his little hands reached for me first. Melissa still came around, but less often. When she did, she remained polite but stiff, her words clipped, her smile forced. She never mentioned the hospital anymore, never dared bring up her cruel words about bad luck. It was as though she hoped silence would erase them. But silence doesn't erase truth, it only sharpens it. One Sunday after church, Daniel carried the baby into the fellowship hall. Melissa trailed behind, her heels clicking on the tile, her expression unreadable. People flocked toward us as they always did now, their attention focused on the child, and inevitably on me. "Look at him," Mrs. Carter cooed. "He just adores his grandmother." Another woman leaned in, smiling. "Eleanor, you're a blessing. That boy will always know what you did for him." Melissa stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue. For once she said nothing at all. And in her silence, I saw the full measure of my vindication. Later that afternoon, Daniel came by my house. The baby giggled in his arms as we sat on the porch, the sunlight warm on our faces. "Mom," Daniel said softly, his voice steady now, "I want you to know something." No matter what Melissa says or doesn't say, I'll never forget what you did, and I'll make sure he never forgets either. He nodded toward his son, who was happily clapping his hands. Tears stung my eyes, but I only smiled. "That's all I need, Daniel. That's enough." That evening after they left, I sat in my rocking chair, the house quiet around me. I thought back to that first day, standing in their living room, my arms full of gifts, my heart open only to be told, "Don't touch the baby, you'll bring bad luck." How those words had crushed me, how they had lingered like a curse. And yet here I was. The baby I wasn't allowed to touch now knew my arms better than anyone's. The daughter-in-law who had tried to erase me could no longer meet my eyes. And the son who once stayed silent now stood beside me, grateful and loyal again. It wasn't anger or revenge that had brought me here. It was something quieter, stronger, presence, love, endurance, the kind of strength that outlives cruelty. As the stars blinked awake in the night sky, I sipped my tea and let peace settle into my bones. Bad luck, she had called me. But in the end, it was my hand that signed the papers, my voice that soothed the child, my love that carried us all through the storm. And that I thought with a small smile, is the luck that truly matters.